Welcome back to Monkeys on Typewriters on YouTube. We're continuing in our series on how does this end, and we've been learning a lot about various plagues and pandemics throughout history and inferences made about their influence prehistory. We're continuing on in this episode talking about smallpox, and then you're going to hear a summary of the sort of lessons that ought to be learned from all of these past experiences of humans and pathogens. And then that'll lead into subsequent parts in this series relating specifically to SARS-CoV-2 and what we should be learning from these past experiences in approaching that particular pandemic virus. So I'll hand it over to you, Arijit, and you can take us into learning more about smallpox.
Thanks, Ryan. And today we're going to dive into the talk will be in two parts. So we're going to jump right into smallpox first, and we're going to keep going back and forth, as you pointed out, Ryan, between smallpox and kind of alluding to what the similarities are, what inferences one can draw. As we talked about in the earlier episodes, you during the pandemic we've had a lot of press around what history teaches us about pandemics, and often that press is gratuitously irrational, right? We had history professors saying, well, history teaches us that pandemics are over when we feel like it. There's real articles to that extent. The notion that a pandemic is a social construct. It's not. It's an epidemic construct. It's an epidemiological construct, and we're still in the middle of a pandemic, as viewers are well aware. And the reason is because it's a global outbreak of a disease that flares up unpredictably, characterized by rapid evolution. And it is the case that other diseases in the historical past have been capable of delivering very high levels of mortality and have been widespread. And some of those were classified as epidemics as well. But today we'll take a look at one of those, which is smallpox. We didn't have massive smallpox pandemics the way we had massive plague pandemics that lasted centuries. But smallpox, which is, theoretically an endemic disease at the time, was capable of depopulating large swaths of the globe. And we'll talk about that today. We'll talk about, again, this sort of in the context of how this sort of pandemic endemic thing is really has no bearing on whether a disease is a threat or not in the first place. So smallpox is caused by the variola virus. It's an extinct disease, knock on wood. It's airborne. It does also spread to some extent through fomites, but it's thought to be substantially airborne. Although it takes a very long while for an infected person to infect others in their vicinity. This is part of the reason why there was this perception that smallpox is primarily fomite driven. But we actually have a paper coming up very soon, a preprint which will drop this week, that shows that a lot of smallpox's transmission was actually airborne, and it was the low level of infectiousness of smallpox that contributed to that sort of surface transmission perception. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's not necessarily the dominant or most efficient route. So when people would get smallpox, they would get infected, and it would take about 14 days for them to develop fatigue. And then from there, they would develop a rash. And during the rash period that would coincide with their peak infectiousness. And so people have done studies based on historical data to infer the peak infectiousness. And the peak infectiousness basically occurred in the first week or so of the post-rash rash appearance phase. 1 to 50% of cases with smallpox died. So that's a very wide range for a case fatality rate. And the reason is there's a few different reasons for that. One is there were different kinds of smallpox, and they had wildly different case fatality rates. So depending on how it manifested in an individual's body, the risk of death was very different. Now, these different case fatality rates are not necessarily due to different clades of smallpox. They're actually most likely due to different routes of infection, different doses of the disease. However, there was also a contribution of smallpox viral clades, which we'll talk about. So there was a genetic aspect to these widely varying case fatality rates as well. Notably, smallpox gave people lifelong immunity, and there were no animal reservoirs, which was the reason why the WHO was able to eradicate the disease. And as we know, and as we've discussed in this group, eradicating the disease is not the only way to control it. It's a false choice between, well, if you can't control the disease, you must let everybody get it as often as possible. Otherwise, you're doing something wrong. So, but smallpox, lucky for us, was one of those rare diseases that was actually possible to eradicate. I think pretty much every other disease, I would argue, or nearly every other disease, is not something where eradication should even be a feasible goal. But disease control and eradication are different things. So, smallpox emerged in the human population about 3,300 years ago, most likely. So, it's a very new disease, as we discussed in the first part of this talk, episode 1 and 2. Uh, Many diseases have been with us for millions of years. Many diseases have an association with humans that date back to before humans existed as a species, and those are often the milder diseases. And smallpox, being relatively young, was fairly nasty. Although there is some controversy about the figure in terms of when exactly it entered humans, but it's a slow evolving disease. So very, very slow mutation accumulation rate, very, very few. So not only does it not incur mutations, those mutations don't get fixed in the population. And so in contrast, SARS-CoV-2 fixes mutations at the rate of one per 1,000 base pairs every year, which is a lot, as we now know. So actually, smallpox diverged a long time ago into variola major and variola minor, and these coexisted for centuries. Um, what's interesting about smallpox is it was so ingrained in our societies that people actually had goddesses for smallpox. So this is the Hindu goddess of smallpox, Shitala, and the painting actually comes from a school of painting associated with the temple. It was right down the street from where I grew up. They actually would worship this goddess up into the 70s. Then they stopped, and ironically, Shitala is now still worshipped, but she's worshipped for COVID. So during COVID, they were worshiping her. Um, Trade one disease out for another, right? So variola major and variola minor, as we were discussing, were two different clades, and they're two distinctly genetically distinct variants of the virus, so to speak. They diverged from each other centuries ago. And variola major had a 30% case fatality rate, while variola minor had a much, much lower case fatality rate. And people have actually gone in and mapped the exact virulence determinants for these strains. So we can say with some degree of confidence that you have genetic determinants of virulence for this particular virus. Now, what's interesting is that, again, this virus existed for centuries in humans, in 1,000 years. It never became less mild. There were simply coexisting clades that had differing CFRs. There was no trend towards mildness for smallpox. And this was part of the problem. Part of the problem was you would have smallpox clades, variola minor clades, sweeping through the population, creating immunity, and then variola major clades coming through at other intervals with much higher kill rates. So because of this, there were a few different things when it came to smallpox, endemic smallpox in the West, in Europe and in Asia. So in the old world, endemic smallpox had a few different traits, and one of which was it was a major killer of children. And then as people got older, it you essentially either had immunity or basically, if you had missed the wave that swept through, then it would take a while again for the population to build up susceptibles to the point where another wave was going to sweep through, if that makes sense. So essentially, this is a key point, which is that smallpox is not that transmissible. So if you the proportion of the population that's susceptible was really what mattered in driving those waves of infection. And so if you had a population with where everyone was susceptible, smallpox could take off very easily in that. If you had a population in which there was a mix of susceptibles and non-susceptible individuals, because smallpox was not that transmissible, you just didn't have the same amount of penetration of the disease. As I mentioned, because smallpox takes a long time to transmit from one person to the next, really that R naught, which we don't, I'm not sure what the exact numbers are for the R naught, but it should be right north of one, is my suspicion, which would essentially create a situation where you have you have a low level of reduction of susceptibles required to slow transmission down. And so, moving on from the topic of the clades, one of the things to keep in mind with smallpox is that there were actually plagues associated with it. So, for example, the Antonine plague in AD 165 in the Roman Empire was thought to have been due to smallpox. And smallpox epidemics, as I said, would flare up from time to time. So, in 1750, for example, there was a devastating flare up in Europe. There were New England flare ups as well that were very devastating. And sure enough, although smallpox was endemic, during an outbreak, you would see a significant increase in mortality. In the ruined town of Palmyra, out in I think it's in Syria now. Um, they actually went through and looked at historians went through and looked at tombstones, and what they found was that the number of tombstones attributable to any given year in a particular cemetery varied very widely. And it was similarly the case for a graveyard that they found in Lydia, in Greece, in what was ancient Greece, part of ancient Greece. And what they found was that the frequency of tombstones varied widely, and they could pinpoint this to the historical record with associating it with years in which smallpox epidemics were known to be sweeping through these areas. So when smallpox swept through a population, it did a good bit of killing, but it really needed that little extra bit of susceptibles in order to get that, to keep it cranking. Uh, and we'll return to that in a bit because there was a very famous smallpox epidemic that becomes worth talking about in this context, and that's the smallpox epidemic that devastated the Aztecs in the 16th century. Now, because we coexisted with smallpox for thousands of years, old world populations actually have some degree of resistance to smallpox. And so there's a protein on the surface of white blood cells that acts as a receptor for chemokines. And this is used as cell surface entry portal, if you will, for pox viruses. And it turns out that there is an allele in this chemokine receptor, CCR5, which is a deletion allele, which was under strong positive selection. And it turns out that 700 years of smallpox was sufficient for this allele to be sort of jacked up in the population up to 10%. So, so the reason this came up was that CCR5 delta 32 is an HIV resistance allele. And people were curious, why on earth does CCR5 have a resistance allele? So that they were asking the question, is it smallpox or is it plague? And we had looked at this allele previously for plague. And it turns out it was not a major driver of resistance for, plague was not a major driver of selective pressure for CCR5. Smallpox kills differently. It kills children preferentially. And it turns out that was sufficient as a selective pressure to really jack up the frequency of the allele in the human population. So these simulations were evolutionary simulations done based on inferring the strength of the selection pressure and seeing what would happen. So as we talked about, smallpox has led to the collapse of whole populations. So in theory, this is a disease that was considered endemic in the old world. But even endemic diseases can have this outcome. So when smallpox showed up in the Aztec Empire, the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, was swept by smallpox in 1520. And around 40% of inhabitants were killed in a single year. Now, for smallpox, that's a high IFR. And that high IFR is likely coming from evolved resistance in the old world population. As I mentioned, in the old world, the CFRs were variable, but often quite a bit lower. So smallpox at 40% for the Aztecs was on the high end of the range. Not out of the range completely, but still on the higher end. And the main thing here is that the military age population got wiped out. So the Cuitlahuac, who was the Aztec emperor at the time, was killed. That led to a succession struggle inside Tenochtitlan. And then immediately after that, Cortez laid siege to Tenochtitlan. So by that time, the conquistadors were on the premises, as it were. They were in country when the smallpox epidemic swept through. So they saw this as a signal from God because the Aztecs got wiped out. They did not. And so then the question was why, right? And the common perception is that, well, they had built up enough immunity to smallpox that that's why they weren't killed off. But in Europe, smallpox is primarily a killer of little children. So when people look at the distribution of smallpox deaths above and below 10 years old, what they found was that 95 to 98%, or even more of the deaths uh, due to smallpox were in children. So there's something going on physiologically with the disease where children are impacted disproportionately to begin with. Then, on top of that, because you can only get smallpox once, so by definition, the question then is what percentage of the population was getting smallpox and surviving? We already know that. The percent of the population that would get smallpox and survive was on the order of, 60%, 60 to 70%, depending on the clade. But again, because smallpox epidemics, flare ups happen at widely spaced intervals, 1 generation or more, most people would have lived through one epidemic of smallpox at most in their lives. So the CFR in Europe was 15 to 30%, and 7% of all deaths were due to smallpox. So smallpox was definitely a major driver of population structure and of genetics. And to think of it this way, infectious diseases are a major predator for humans. In fact, they are the most significant predator in modern human societies after like the Bronze Age, if you will. Right after the Bronze Age, most of the predation has been due to infectious disease. We don't really often see people being carried off by wild animals in the street. I mean, if you do, you do. That's that. I'm willing to acknowledge that that might happen, but I would say it's probably quite rare. So no matter where you live. So the point is that infectious disease was what was shaping the population. And so we know that there was some degree of resistance to smallpox that was evolved. But now if you look at the conquistadors and you try to separate what is the role of the age structure of the conquistadors versus immunity versus pre-existing resistance that was genetically derived, you see some very interesting things. So you can back into from knowing that 95% of the deaths were due to smallpox were in children. 95% of the smallpox deaths were in children. You can back into the infection fatality rate and separate it out between children and adults. So the children's fatality rate was about 70%. So as yeah, and then the adult fatality rate was about 2%. So I misspoke earlier. I said it was about a 40 to 50%. That's the aggregate. But actually, for people who got smallpox, they had a 70% chance of dying if they were kids. So once you do the math and you sort of grind it out, it turns out that about 15% of the population would have been smallpox survivors, just as a rough estimate. So most of the conquistadors were not smallpox survivors. Now, on top of that, a significant percentage of smallpox sort of survivors end up blind in one or both eyes. So obviously that's not going to be helpful if you're trying to go be a conquistador. So take those people out of the population as well. So even if you assume, a small percentage of people being blinded, your 15% of the population being immune to smallpox is an upper bound. So if you say, okay, well, if everyone was infected, what would the mortality rate be? It would be about 2%. Now, there were only 500 troops in Cortez's expedition, so we would have expected about 10 deaths if everyone was infected. So there's two explanations from here. So one is that the small number could easily have escaped notice. And the other is that the small proportion of the immune population in there was enough to tip smallpox's R naught, or R as it were, which is the reproductive number, below 1, preventing smallpox from spreading within the conquistador population. So that would translate to very few people getting infected and no one dying. And so more or less that was the outcome. It was a mix of age structure and resistance with a minor contribution from immunity that was protecting these troops from smallpox. And the key point here is that evolution and age structure played a significant role in this as well. So when we think about this in terms of learning to live with the disease, it wasn't that in the old world everyone had smallpox and this was going to give the conquistadors a big advantage. It was in fact that this was a virgin soil epidemic, and smallpox having an R naught of close to 1 was vulnerable to the susceptible population. It swept through the Aztecs, and it killed off a huge number of people right away, including military age folks, that, where that was not the case in the old world. So this went on for centuries, in fact. So again, smallpox was considered an endemic disease, but the smallpox epidemics in the New World led to depopulation. So functionally, they led to extinction of whole indigenous populations. In Haiti, there was an indigenous population of Indians who were wiped out, and very, very few people with Taino ancestry exist today, and they're all mixed in. But the actually full separate indigenous population of Taino Indians was wiped out due to smallpox. And there were other diseases as well that played a role in this, like measles, which we are all welcoming back with open arms now, and typhus, which we haven't yet gotten around to rolling the red carpet out for, but I don't doubt that we will. And there were other factors as well. But with all of that being said, smallpox played a very significant role in this. And this happened in waves and waves of disease, often like about one generation apart, as you can see, as we discussed, about 25 to 40 years apart each time. And so what it comes down to is that even in quote unquote endemic disease, until you have a buildup of resistance in the population, that is a buildup of resistance in the population, not immunity, a buildup of resistance that comes from generations having been exposed to it, can be very destabilizing. And this is also relevant in the context of COVID, because endemic smallpox would lead to repeated waves of mass mortality. It happened out in the West. It happened much more significantly in the New World. And so the old world experience with smallpox was magnified and amplified in the New World, and it was essentially destabilizing. And so eventually, because smallpox was vaccine preventable, we eliminated the disease. But an established disease that is endemic and capable of spawning epidemics is also capable of destabilizing society. And that, I think, is one of the key take homes from smallpox. It was a leading cause of death before vaccination. And as we discussed, virgin soil populations were often devastating. Now, the actual extent to which the disease spread was occurring due to immunity, but the death rates were largely driven due to age structure and evolved resistance, most likely. And so what it comes down to is you don't necessarily want that sort of, when it comes to COVID, for example, immunity will not help you anyway in terms of decreasing the number of infected individuals. But on the other hand, if you wait, 5, 10,000 years, I'm guessing, you'll probably build up enough evolved resistance in the population that COVID becomes less of a threat. But as you can see, this was not the way we chose to deal with smallpox. What we chose to do instead was to go right after it. And these crises often take decades to play out. Like for smallpox, each of the waves of smallpox that swept through in places like Palmyra and Lydia were, 5 years, 10 years long. It was the same in North America, as you can see from this graph, from this slide. Each of these were multi-year events, and they were happening at regular intervals, and they would have kept happening the whole time if we hadn't opted for eliminating smallpox. And so it's not the case that a virus that is in coexistence with humans becomes milder over time. We've seen that here. The virulence would bounce around, but it was due to genetically different strains. And so once again, endemicity is not domestication. And it's well within the realm of the possible that virulence levels bounce around. There's no monotonic declining trend for this virus either. So summing it all up, what exactly does history teach us about pandemics, right? And so pandemics can result from sudden increases in virulence of established pathogens. You could argue that what was happening with smallpox was more or less pandemic grade behavior, even though technically it was considered an epidemic. These sudden increases in virulence or sudden increases in susceptibility make a big difference. There are two kinds of pandemics, the ones that you see with coevolution and the ones you see without. In smallpox's case, you were seeing an oscillation because there were different clades coexisting. But smallpox was not necessarily co-evolving with humans in the way that plague was. So when you have pandemics that have sort of a repeated reseeding of infectious disease agents, those pandemics can take generations to play out. As we saw with plague, Some of those plague pandemics lasted, went through multi-generational households over a period of like 60 to 80 years. Mortality rates bounce around all over the place during even within a pandemic, and for established endemic disease, it can oscillate a lot. And red queen pandemics can last with it's unclear when you do have coevolution. It's unclear how long that pandemic. There's no real set timeline for the pandemic. So this is sort of part one, if you will, of this sort of what does history teach us story. Uh, but there's another aspect to this as well, right? Which is we've often heard it said, look, you've got to learn to live with the disease because it's bad for business to not learn to live with the disease. And somehow sold to us that having mass infectious disease sweeping through the population over and over again will lead to, through some alchemy, better economic outcomes. That somehow, if we were to sacrifice enough people, we would end up with a better economy, right? And this has been sort of the quasi-Darwinian, sometimes quiet part said out loud um, position of public health. We've had people like Fauci say, well, the vulnerable will fall by the wayside, and kind of implying that that's a good thing. And, I find it finally ironic that many of the individuals who themselves advocated for vulnerable people falling by the wayside appear to have disappeared from public life. Um, one wonders why that is. But the idea that somehow you're going to have people get disease, get COVID, for example, every year or every other year, and things are just going to be just fine, is not supported by other historical pandemics. So this comes back to that whole, the mayor in Jaws leaving the beach open because it's apparently good for good for business. No, it's only good for business if you get rid of the shark. If the beach is open and the shark is present, right? That outcome is worse than if the beach was open and the shark was not present, which is the one you're wishing for. So simply leaving the beach open without removing the shark doesn't lead you to the best outcome. It leads you to the worst outcome. And we're going to see that now in terms of the economic impact of historical pandemics, the ones we've discussed, plus a few others. So the key thing to remember is the emergence of a novel pathogen in human populations is a violent event. So most pandemics, as we've seen, are driven by a novel pathogen, sometimes with increased virulence and increased transmissibility, showing up on day one. And so that first contact is often bloody, the virgin soil epidemic kind of concept. Now, that pandemic phase can last for years or decades. It is absolutely true that if you leave a virus or a pathogen hanging out in humans for long enough, humans build up evolve resistance to that, right? And we've seen that that time scale is on the order of 500 years for a very deadly disease that kills many children, which was malaria we saw in the Cape Verde Islands, where you had resistance evolving in the human population over 500 years because malaria killed half the children. So yes, you can sort of build up resistance in this process of antagonistic coevolution. But we've seen previously with other animal species that that's an antagonistic coevolution. So even if you build up resistance, as rabbits did with myxomatosis, the story is not over. In the case of myxomatosis, it's a very accelerated story. The rabbits, every year you get a new rabbit population. And so with that, over a period of years, you get immunity building up in the rabbit population. And then you can watch the other side of that Red Queen's race in rabbits, in wild rabbit populations, because the virus immediately develops counters to that, as we saw. Now, that's a very accelerated process. But what's happened with myxomatosis in 70 years has been a rapid process of rabbit resistance evolution and then viral leveraging of that resistance to again jack up its transmission, which is what you'd expect. So presumably, if we hung around for 100 generations of humans, we may see the same effects with COVID. But again, that's not a viable public health strategy. So virulence and coevolution do have a relationship with each other, but that relationship can bounce around. So what does this mean in a practical sense when you are dealing with a brand new pandemic? What it means is that you have usually a massive bolus of death. That bolus of death may taper off, and then again a year or two later, while still in the pandemic phase, or even 10 years later, while still in the pandemic phase, you can get another wave of death within the same pandemic. We saw this with influenza, which was year to year. We saw this with plague, which was on the order of like 20 years or 40 years. So long-running pandemics do leave a fingerprint of natural selection, but novel pathogens are still never domesticated. And all of these things have really like direct consequences when when we're talking about the way in which a pandemic shapes human societies and human economies, right? So when you have an emergent population in an emergent pathogen in human populations, if you can prevent it from gaining a foothold, that's actually your best bet. If you think about it, if public health's job is to shepherd every new emergent pathogen, out of the wilderness, out of the rainforests or out of the dairy farms into humans, and that's its whole job, and shepherd it to midwife it to a point of endemicity, then all that we would do in the human population is keep accumulating new pathogens every so often. Because once a pathogen enters, it won't leave unless, like smallpox, you can eradicate it. But if it entered from a zoonotic population, then by definition, you already have a reservoir. So eradication in that way is off the table. Um, so what does that mean in practical terms? Well, in practical terms, what it means is that when a pandemic shows up, you are very likely to have a period of destabilization. Now, the most canonical example of that is the one we discussed with the Black Death and Mongol. This is the most famous example, if you will, of that sort of canonical link between a pandemic and a military threat or a civil threat, or a political threat. But there are many other forms of unrest as well, right? So in many historical examples, the plague of Cyprian, the plague of Justinian, the Black Death, and others, what ended up happening as a result of a pandemic is that weird stuff started happening societally. So during the plague of Cyprian, for example, the Romans got very into this business of persecuting Christians. So it flared up during the plague of Cyprian because Christians got blamed for the pandemic. Modern parallels, anyone? And there was civil war as a result of that. So what happened actually is the Roman Empire actually split, clean split, for a few years in during that era, and it was because of civil war that in turn was driven by manpower shortages for food, manpower shortages for essentially maintenance of basic infrastructure. So people were bitterly unhappy. There was inflation, there was food shortages, and that got turned into sort of civil unrest, which finally led to military, escalated to a military conflict within the Roman Empire. That's just one example. The plague of Justinian, again, same deal. There was a mass death swept through the Byzantine Empire in 542 AD, and immediately there was inflation. Obviously, the tax base shrunk, so they had to jack up taxes. Then there was rising social tension. There was a whole series of revolts, and eventually the Byzantine Empire largely was destabilized by the seventh century as a result. And actually, if you look at a map of the Byzantine Empire, it's very striking because it really shrinks after, in the sixth century following the plague of Justinian. And so a lot of that, again, is linked to infectious disease. The Black Death, and this is a very famous example, it also led to peasant revolts immediately after the Black Death, or even during the years that are considered part of the Black Death. And throughout the second plague pandemic, which lasted beginning from the Black Death into the 17th century, there was a tremendous amount of destabilization of governments in Europe. And a lot of that can be laid at the door, especially what happened immediately after the Black Death. A lot of it can be laid at the door of the fact that the feudal class, the serfs on the receiving end of feudalism, suddenly found themselves with increased leverage as a result of mass death. So, but also during the Black Death, there was religious persecution. Again, they went after the Jews because the Jews were thought to be responsible for the Black Death. So we see a lot of this. We see intolerance, we see inflation and socioeconomic displacement, if you will, of people from their, in terms of their living standards and in terms of their quality of life. And you see a lot of anger towards governments with long-running pandemics. The cholera pandemic in India, and actually, sorry, the plague pandemic was another great example of this. It What ended up happening, we'll discuss in more detail, was that it sort of cost the British a lot of credibility when cholera swept through. The same thing happened in Paris in the middle of the 19th century, where there were riots and due to a cholera epidemic, and that again led to a rebellion in Paris. Now, it's true that 19th century French rebellions, 18th and 19th century French rebellions and riots were nothing unusual, but this one was timed very closely with the cholera epidemic. So again, this is just civil unrest, and So let's dive in a little more into the Indian example, because actually this is something that I'm familiar with. My grandmother, who was born at the turn of the 20th century, early 20th century, was the last in a family of 13, and she was the only survivor because all of her siblings died due to infectious disease, and so the bubonic plague swept through in at the 1896 to 1901 with a pretty substantial death toll. Then there were recurrent outbreaks of cholera all through the late 19th, early 20th century. Then there was the Spanish flu, um, which again had one of the highest death tolls globally. Then there was smallpox. Then there was malaria. So a lot of these things sort of were large enough in terms of epidemic outbreaks that they were disruptive to society. The picture that you're looking at here is the British spraying houses with disinfectant in 1897 during a plague epidemic. And so this kind of thing really came down to a lack of sanitation in the cities and a lack of effective British control the of these outbreaks. And again, it's not many of these Indian cities are centuries old, so this problem would have predated the British, but it didn't matter because it was fuel for the fire for Indian nationalism, which was already rising for good reason otherwise. So there were Indian nationalists who were jailed for criticizing the government's poor performance during plague. The same thing happened with cholera. The same thing happened again with Spanish flu, and there was a lot of sort of increased public disillusionment that happened right around the time of the Spanish flu. And so some of that ended up leading to, basically full-on massacres in sports stadiums or in on playing fields with machine guns. And so it really sort of had this positive feedback component to it, where the British were trying to bring these diseases under control. What they were doing was draconian, but it was not effective in many cases. That led to resentment, and that resentment led to that fanned the flames of nationalism as such. So, what ended up happening a lot in both direct ways like this and also subtle ways, like for example malaria, was that the British grip on India was weakened during a period of intense infectious disease. And in fact, a funny one is that because the British were afraid of malaria, they would congregate in these hill stations in colonial enclaves that were at much higher elevations where it was much cooler. And that congregation basically meant that there weren't enough enough soldiers in the cities, enough officers in the cities to maintain control. And so, but when you look at it sort of at an aggregate level, it definitely was not helpful to the British that during that period, during the late 19th and early 20th century, infectious disease was sort of gripping India in very regular ways, almost every year, every other year, and the newspapers were talking about it. Now, pandemics can also lead to military defeats. We talked about the Black Death, and we talked about the Mongol invasion, but there are many other examples as well. So, for example, the Plague of Athens wiped out the Athenian fighting age population, and that had a big impact on the Peloponnesian War. The Antonine Plague, for example, weakened the Roman Empire at a critical time when it was fighting the Germans. And it prevented the Roman Empire from expanding northward, many argue, because essentially it permanently weakened the frontiers by sort of giving the Germanic tribes repeated wins against the Romans and really sort of moving the Romans to a defensive posture in Northern Europe. The Black Death, in addition to the impact of the Black Death during the Mongol invasions out west, the Black Death also played a role in the Hundred Years' War. And so during the Hundred Years' War, the English had made a lot of progress in conquering large chunks of France. When the Black Death swept through and it changed the balance, essentially it impacted the two sides differentially. And in doing so, it basically shifted the military momentum away from the English at a critical time. Now, it's interesting because you'd say, well, the Black Death obviously was sweeping through, so why did it matter? Obviously, when you have a pandemic sweeping through two different warring parties, it may affect both parties differently at any given moment in time. And if one of the parties, the one combatant party that is less impacted, can figure out that that's what's happening, it allows them to press an advantage. We actually saw this during the early stages of the COVID pandemic, where Armenia was fighting Azerbaijan, and the Armenian troops were extremely weakened from COVID that had just hit them. It was causing chaos on the Armenian side. and that was thought to have played a role in what was a very, very one-sided military victory at the time by Azerbaijan in 2020. So it's absolutely possible in the modern era as well. Um, so we can keep going like this, but the point is that there are multiple examples like this that you can dig up from history. And the point is that whenever you have a pandemic that really is sweeping through a population, even if it affects people on both sides of a border, sort of roughly similarly at any given moment in time, it can really impact plans. And so one example of that in a very concrete way was what happened during World War One. So during World War One, right at the very end, in 1918, the Germans put through a major push, and that spring offensive was supposed to bring the war to an end. The year was 1918. People were exhausted on both sides, and so if the Germans had won the spring offensive, they would have cracked open the British and French lines, and the outcome could have been very different. But instead, what happened was the Germans essentially the spring offensive faltered, uh, and the Germans ran out of manpower. And what's interesting is that not only that, but when the second wave came through, it again affected Germany differentially. If you think about it, the Allies had a deeper reserve of manpower than the Germans. So even if you had a similar number of fighting age men depleted on both sides, this would favor the Allies, and that's exactly what happened. So as the fall wave of influenza swept through, the Germans didn't have enough soldiers to basically start, essentially provide a stiff resistance. And so that impacted the 100 Days Offensive. The 100 Days Offensive is what's credited with ending World War One. Essentially, there was a series of about 100, or also known as the 100-day battles. There was a series of battles, one after the other, at which point Germany realized it could not win. And so this was sort of like an overall change in the balance of power. There were many other reasons as well that influenced that you can argue favored the Allies over the Germans, and some of this is luck of the draw, but some of this also comes down to this is how pandemics operate. It becomes a roll of the dice. We have a pandemic uh, rolling through at the time of major military conflict. And again, keep in mind that major military conflicts tend to accumulate very large numbers of soldiers on both sides or large concentrations of soldiers. The whole reason why the 1918 flu pandemic started was because the US was piling up soldiers in camps throughout throughout North America, and Camp Funston was the sort of focal point for the 1918-1919 pandemic. So again, that sort of synergy, if you will, unfortunate synergy between infectious disease and military outcomes is well documented in the history books. But it goes beyond that as well. Pandemics are not good for complex systems either. So if you look at complex systems, many of the empires of old relied on, or many of the institutions of old relied on complex systems, right? So whether you look at the Roman Empire with its grain supply chain, or you look at the way the Byzantines collected their taxes, or you look at the way the feudal system was set up, or trade along the Silk Road, in every one of these cases, you have a complex system that was profoundly disrupted by a pandemic sweeping through. So, for example, the Antonine plague depopulated whole cities and villages along the grain routes, and this in turn sort of negatively impacted the supply chain. Similarly, the Silk Road was profoundly disrupted by the Black Death, and so the Silk Road, the Black Death in its early stages helped the Mongols in certain places, but overall it also weakened the Mongol empire's access to resources because trade was negatively impacted, and that in turn was one of the reasons why the Mongol Empire was so short-lived. Essentially, it fragmented immediately after Genghis Khan's death, and one of the reasons is because it immediately fell into hard times financially. So, uh, a really interesting example from this publication some years ago is about what happened, what the Black Death did to medieval Egypt. So, medieval Egypt had this really complex system of irrigation canals that was sort of up and down the Nile. And what happened during the Black Death was essentially Egypt had like a 40% death rate during some of these waves. So it was not terrible, but it was pretty significant. There were other parts of the old world that were hit much harder with Black Death, but this was enough to destabilize the system of dikes and ditches and canals that the Egyptians had in place. So many of the canals and dams fell into disrepair, and that led to increased flooding. So the whole way in which the Nile Delta was essentially habitable was because they had managed it through this very sophisticated um, web of canals and drainage, and that sort of managed the annual flooding of the Aswan of the Nile. And so what ended up happening was when you had a large number of deaths coming through, there was just enough disruption that some of these different pieces of it began to fall apart, and that sort of the coincidence of the decay of the irrigation system and the then loss of agricultural productivity can be lined up very neatly with the deaths that happened. So essentially, if you look over here on the left, you can see that you had a peak around give or take um, around 1540, and then when you look at the rate at which agricultural productivity evolved over time, what you see is over time as the sorry around my bad the peak happened in the 14th century. And so when you look at the outcome in the 14th and 15th centuries from there, what you can see is that there was a profound drop in agricultural productivity going into the 15th century and beyond that in ancient Egypt. So this kind of pandemic driven system failure has very long term consequences. A similar thing happened with Italy. During the 17th century, northern Italy was hit with a glancing blow from the plague. I believe their demographic change was a few percentage points. It was like 3% or 5%. Um, and so what ended up happening was this ended up sort of, as you can see in the graph on the top left, this is where the plague hit. So you can see that the plague sort of swept through northern Italy in the first half of the 17th century, and then it was gone. Now, if you look at what happened during that same era, and you look at the years, the plague years, and then you look at what happened to production of things like wool and linen in places like Venice and Florence, you see a decline in the years following that sort of lasted out. But not only that, that decline in economic productivity also corresponded to a failure of urbanization in the region. So what you see is over time, um, the rate of urbanization was decreased in through Italy in a way that France, the Netherlands, and Germany did not see. And so the authors of this paper made the point that essentially the plague that hit in the 17th century caused a loss of artisans and critical knowledge that in turn caused a loss of trade. If you kill off the artisans, um, you don't get the same quality of goods, and that in turn reduced the demand for Venetian and Florentian fabrics, and that led to prolonged long-term decline. So again, not only does it impact complex systems in the sense of complex physical systems as we saw in Egypt, but also complex systems in terms of complex knowledge-based systems. It turns out if you have disease killing people off, that's not good for the economy either, if those people are experts, as you can see from this example. Here's another example of this. This was in medieval Spain. And in medieval Spain, essentially, when the Black Death hit, again, this was a relatively glancing blow, but that demographic shock that happened in the 14th century destroyed commercial networks. And again, if you look at the rate of urbanization, what you see is post Black Death. If you look at where the Spanish economy was, if you look at this band in the 14th century, you can see that they lost a full century because of the Black Death. It was another century before they had recovered, or more, to the pre-plague era. In fact, yeah, nearly two centuries. So Spain was very dependent on trade, and the trade networks were a big part of how Spain sort of flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries. When the Black Death came through, this was very instrumental in sort of holding Spain back for a long period of time afterwards. So again, the recurrent theme is this, which is pandemics are not good for the economy, and pandemics are not good for um, civil society or from a military perspective. When these things come together, they can have a devastating impact because all of those impacts can hit at the same time sometimes, as was the case with the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire had multiple different plagues, and if you look at the history of the Roman Empire and you sort of map it over to the plagues, you can see something very interesting, which is usually after a severe pandemic swept through the Roman Empire, there will be changes in the political structure and in the shape of the empire itself. So, for example, we talked about the Antonine Plague and how essentially Rome was expanding its borders all the way up to the second century AD, and it stopped after the Antonine Plague, which one can, a plausible hypothesis is that the string of defeats that the Romans faced with the Germanic tribes was sufficient to prevent expansion. The plague of Cyprian created widespread manpower shortages. It weakened the empire because those crises not only led to shortages for recruitment, but they also led to food shortages, inflation, civil unrest, and we talked about this, the civil wars. The crisis of the third century, if you look at the dates, pretty neatly follows the plague of Cyprian. And so this is sort of a recurrent theme. And we talked about the plague of Justinian as well, which was really also the Roman Empire in a certain sense, the Byzantines. So you have this sort of recurrent theme of plague sweeping through, impacting economic production, impacting military readiness, impacting civil, if you will, civil stability. And some of these things can all hit at the same time. And so we talked about the Roman Empire in terms of a polycrisis. There have been other polycrises through history. The Black Death was another polycrisis, as we talked about now. Egypt was hit by a polycrisis, which we also discussed. And a lot of the depopulation that happened, leading to irrigation system collapse, then led to civil unrest in Egypt and led to centuries of Egyptian decline. In China, the second plague pandemic in the 17th century led to a series of issues. In fact, one interesting thing is some of these pandemics have caused so much depopulation that there was a drop in economic activity. If you look at the deposition of, I forget what, lead, I think, lead in the soil through Roman Spain. People have dug through it and they found that the deposition of lead in the layers of the soil going back to the Roman era can be correlated to the drop in production of coins that was linked to pandemics. And so the Romans were big miners of metal, and they mined so much metal that they would actually change the landscape. So, for example, there's a UNESCO World Heritage Site in northern Spain, which we went to last year, where it looks like you're on the moon, but actually it's an old Roman mine. And so they would like strip mine the whole place for copper and for precious metals, and then they would smelt, so it would all end up in the air. And lead, which was not what they were looking for, would often get vaporized. So they caused so much. The plagues caused so much death in the Roman Empire that you had changes in climate, and so you had these sort of little ice ages or severe cold snaps that would follow because you'd get reforestation and you'd get a reduction in literally sort of global warming on a local level due to depopulation. And this happened both in Rome and happened in China as well. So people talk about how, depopulation, you have these sort of doomers who are like, well, depopulation wouldn't be such a bad thing, right? Sort of, if you will, the accelerationists. And the point is, no, actually, you would see global cooling. And global warming is obviously a very bad thing, but rapid global cooling can really disrupt agriculture as well. And that's what was seen in these cases. So this sort of poly crisis where you have large numbers of people getting killed off, that destabilizing climate, that destabilizing food production in one way or the other, and civil unrest is sort of a recurrent theme. It's such a recurrent theme that, the Bible has a whole thing about it, right? The four horsemen of the apocalypse. This is the whole point, that these things move together. So generally speaking, pandemics and societal collapse are fellow travelers. And the idea that you can have these pandemics just kind of sweeping through with no consequence, that society will just absorb it, is not borne out by the historical record. This is exactly what doesn't happen. What happens when you have a massive pandemic is everything goes sideways. The economy goes sideways. You often have stagflation. You will often have increased civil unrest and war. You will often have other forms of disruption, such as loss of trade advantage that can last for generations. And so the idea that somehow our economies have become magically stronger as a result of letting COVID sweep through and do its thing, while we have 3% of the population every year being removed due to long COVID, while we have people with critical jobs like surgeons and air traffic controllers going through brain fog. somehow all of this is going to lead to a magically stronger economy and better GDP, overall is just not borne out by reality. And it's not borne out by history. And I think this is a key point that, people could have picked up if they had watched the movie Jaws, but I think is worth reinforcing right now. And so that kind of brings us to the end of this series, or this particular piece of the series, which is what does history teach us about pandemics? And as we've talked about, pandemics can last for a very long time. They can have mortality rates bouncing up and down. In general, pandemics are really bad news for civil societies and for economies. And even moderate death rates. Like we were looking at cases with Egypt and with Spain and with Italy, where you had 13%, 14% death rates. This was not the 90% of the post-Columbian depopulation in North America. But even those led to centuries of economic contraction, civil unrest, and profound changes to societal structures. So again, the idea that we can somehow let all this run freely and it's all going to work out well just is absolutely historical. So that concludes this particular lecture. And in the next one, we'll talk about sort of more specifically what happens next with SARS-CoV-2, which is the sponsor of our current pandemic situation.
Yeah, and I think it would be very interesting to move into that topic next. But I'm hoping, as people have been watching this series, they're looking at not only what has happened historically, but the way things are different and not necessarily more robust to those kinds of effects now
Right.
in modern society. So I think we've talked at various points about how certain aspects of human populations and movement and densities and time spent indoors and proximity to high density agricultural practices and all of those things are much worse now, in terms of facilitating the spread of pandemics and the rise of these novel pathogens than they were even in 1918. But you kind of touched on it a little bit at the very end there, and I suspect will come up again, which is that mass mortality or even, 10, 20% mortality is one way to have widespread disruption. Another is, having an increasing percentage of the population disabled by disease. And
Mhm.
I would argue that given the way modern trade works, the way supply chains work, the way transportation works, and the degree to which we need, a large number of different people with different expertise to have the whole system functioning. We saw
Yeah.
during the height of the lockdown kind of period, the disruption in supply chains when you couldn't get certain products in grocery stores and
Yeah.
things. It's a fairly fragile system in many ways, and it doesn't take 20% mortality. It can take disability or disruptions in one part of a supply chain or even just global transportation. And so I guess
Absolutely.
I would encourage people to kind of take these history lessons and modernize them in the context of our global system that we have now and see that it's sort of the net impact of these things that matters and not so much the direct, mortality per se. And that changes your perception a little bit about what this means to allow it to continue running rampant, I think. And hopefully
Yeah.
that's what we're going to be talking about in the next one.
And I think that's a great point. And I think, if you think about in 2020, when for myself and for my collaborators, like when we realized that, the path that we were on with sort of vaccinating people with a vaccine that kind of sort of does something and then calling it good. Once we realized that that's where we were headed, and once we realized what that meant, because we had papers in 2020 that predicted, okay, essentially in one of the papers we say endless waves of disease. Right. And that's where we are today, which is most people can expect to get COVID once a year, once every other year. They're not vaccinating, not taking any precautions. Um, and the vaccine only gives you protection against infection for a matter of months. So you can expect to see a pileup of people with long-term health effects. You can expect to see sort of knock-on effects from that. And all of this was visible in 2020. So in 2020, when we realized that, our first thing was, well, there will be stagflation, there will be civil unrest, there will be increased propensity towards military crises. If you think about it, sort of what does a pandemic do? It shrinks the available workforce and it shrinks it in a way that's not entirely helpful. And what that immediately means is you get a reduction of GDP growth. Because there's fewer people doing the work. You get an increase in expenses because everything costs more to produce because labor prices go up. You get civil unrest because people are pissed about this. This is not making their lives better. And you get ultimately that civil unrest cascading towards military crises, often because governments will start wars to distract from these problems. So you could argue that, for example, what happened in Ukraine was Putin trying to create a distraction from the fact that Russia was not doing well through the early years of the COVID pandemic. And of course, it goes without saying that there are many other things that can cause stagflation, or many other things that can cause civil unrest, or many other things that can start wars. That's all implicit, right? And we know that, for example, climate change plays into that. We know that there are other global macroeconomic trends that are feeding into these, but it doesn't matter. The point is, whatever it is, the pandemic is going to move all of this in a direction that's not helpful. So none of the problems that you face without a pandemic in place, for example, contractionary pressures with the GDP, inflationary pressures, civil unrest, or the rise of sort of intolerance, or military adventurism. None of the problems that you would face on an average day in a pre-pandemic environment, in a pre-pandemic world, suddenly become better because you are letting a pandemic grip through. There's no positive associated with this kind of a strategy. In fact, and it's more or less a given. If you look at the historical trends, it doesn't happen in 1 year, it doesn't happen in two, but give it 15 years, give it 20 years. You keep, it's a FAFO curve, as they say, right? It's a matter of FAFO. Like if you leave this running for long enough, where does it end? That's an open question. And I can tell you that we don't have any examples from history where people have let pandemics run for a very long time and then suddenly everything became okay. Trump's quote of one day it will just disappear and it will all be okay. Yes, you've disappeared it in the same way as the Soviets used to disappear the commissars. But the virus hasn't gotten the memo. And so simply refusing to deal with it just takes you further and further along that FAFO curve. And none of the things that you can expect from sort of an ignored pandemic, none of the long-term outcomes are going to be outcomes you're excited about.
No, and I think there's a real issue with not being able to think in terms of cumulative effects
Yeah,
or knock-on effects, right? And so,
yeah,
these are
yeah,
exacerbating contributors. The climate, not only SARS-CoV-2, but now let's say avian flu starts to become widespread or something else. You have still got the other
yeah.
problem,
You've still
right?
got
Like
the other
it's an
problem.
additive effect, and
You
so
just added one more problem
probably,
to the mix, right?
yeah, it just becomes even
Yeah.
more and more significant. So,
So this
you
idea
know,
that you can simply pretend that the problem doesn't exist and then somehow that'll make everything better is, you know, that's not how it will go.
yeah, it's a very strange sort of math that people do. And you see
Yeah,
that, for example, in discussions around risk of long COVID with subsequent infections. So the standard narrative is, well, the risk with each infection of getting long COVID is, goes down is the claim. So if you're on your fifth infection, the odds of getting long COVID are lower than they were on a per infection basis than on your first infection. But if you've had five infections, your risk overall
it's
is
cumulative.
significantly higher than if you had one or none. And so,
Right.
this cumulative effect. So even if the individual per infection risk goes down, if everyone gets it over and over and over and over again, the total number of people who are disabled by that virus will continue to increase. It'll just increase potentially at a slower slope. But the net effect over time is going to be can be the kinds of stuff that you've been describing has happened historically. So it's just not getting sort of that notion. It's a very sort of immediate analysis, and death rates are not as high as they were in 2020. Therefore, the issue is resolved. It's pretty striking. Um, so
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's
hopefully what
also like
this,
this, right? Say I have Lyme disease, right? And I'm like, look, I have Lyme disease. All right. So that's a big deal. And I say, you know what? Screw it. I'm just going to eat a whole bunch of ice cream because I don't need to worry about being overweight or having a heart attack because I have Lyme disease. And that's what I should be worried about. That's really that's as illogical as it sounds, that's what they're doing. They're like, look, we have these other problems, so let's not worry about this other thing. But the point is, now you have two ways in which things could go sideways, not one.
Hmm. Hmm. What I hope comes across from these talks is, that there are lessons from history, and they're not the ones that we've been kind of given or that people are learning,
Yeah.
and that it's never a very short time span. It's never a single event. It's never an isolated impact of a specific outbreak. It's the cumulative, additive effects, the combined effects of different factors, and it plays out over a long period of time in most cases, right? It's not well, 2020 was the pandemic, and now that's all in the past.
Yeah.
Like, it's just not how it's ever worked. It's never worked that way. And the second major point is that at no point has deciding to live with an emergent disease worked out. It just doesn't work
It's
out.
never worked out.
It
Yeah,
has
it's
never
never
worked
worked
out.
out.
So the notion that the shift, it seems, in what public health sees as their role of, as you say, sort of shepherding emergent pathogens into endemicity, as though that's going to mean domestication.
Yeah.
It's just not a thing that's happened historically. It has not
Yeah. I
happened.
mean, I honestly think that what public health has done in rebranding what they do and sort of reframing their mission as being responsible for midwiving emergent pathogens to endemicity, I think this is just a rebranding of failure. COVID has been a spectacular public health failure, and almost entirely due to political inputs. Uh,
Hmm.
it was always a solvable problem. It's been a spectacular failure, and now suddenly they've been like, well, that's what success looks like.
Right. Yeah.
And really, if that's what success looks like, then we can just get rid of them because they're actually not adding any value at that point.
Yeah.
Because if their goal is to do nothing, if their job is to do nothing, then we can do nothing by ourselves.
Well, just to prevent panic seems to be a big part of that.
Yeah,
Whilst all
absolutely.
this is happening, as long as people don't panic, it's fine.
Yeah, really you could expand it into protecting the public from concerns about its health.
Yeah. Okay. On that note, and knowing that we're moving on next time to talk about SARS-CoV-2 specifically, maybe we'll conclude this section. Thanks again for a very interesting and educational overview. There's a lot here to process, and I hope people will take time to kind of wrestle with some of the issues that are raised here. And we'll try to bring it all together in terms of where we think things are with the current pandemic, based on those lessons in the next part of the series. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.